This lecture is about the Neolithic Revolution and the beginnings of food production. First thing you need to know is that food production appeared independently in different parts of the world. And we are talking about different forms of food that are domesticated and at different times. But we do know for a fact now that there was independent domestication, that this was not the result of diffusion. And you should be familiar with this map, and you should know the areas where independent food production began. And we will be talking about it in more detail in this presentation. So the first thing you should know is that historians and scientists believe that the Neolithic Revolution happened as a result of environmental factors. The number one environmental factor believed to have caused food production is the end of the last ice age and the global warming that occurred as the ice sheets receded and exposed large areas of land that did not have trees and just had very open grasslands in which humans could collect wheat and other types of grains. And then eventually humans discovered that they can spread the seeds over these areas. They could return in the next season and actually gather more. And over a process of about 500 years, humans began adopting agriculture. And this is relatively fast. Another theory, which is also an environmental theory, is the theory of disease. And they basically argued that as more humans began to settle down and population densities increased, disease spread. And people who had chosen to move to settled agriculture developed immunities, where those people who remained hunter-gatherers were susceptible to disease and eventually died out. And therefore, hunter-gatherers ceased to exist in most of the world, and they were replaced by agriculturalists. Okay, the date that you should know here is about 8,000 BCE, give or take. And this is where we have the first experimentation with domesticated plants. Dogs are the first animal to be domesticated. They accompanied hunting and gathering bands, but animal domestication also coincides with food domestication. And it's during this period that we have all of the major domestic animals being domesticated in different parts of the world. Okay, the regions that you should know is Southwest Asia, Mesopotamia, Southeast Asia, China, Mesoamerica, the Northeast in America, and potentially other places throughout the world. Hunting and gathering does not disappear altogether. There are some societies that remain, mostly in remote areas that did not interact with other settled peoples. So, for example, in the Kalahari in northern Japan and in Australia prior to the European settlement of Australia. Okay, so animals that are domesticated include cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and chicken. And you should know the places where these animals were domesticated. And so the first place is the Fertile Crescent. Here we have the earliest food production. In the valley of the Jordan River about 9,000 years ago, we have evidence of barley and wheat being domesticated. And they also domesticated goats and sheep and pigs and cattle, and horses entered the Fertile Crescent from Central Asia. They're believed to have been domesticated, perhaps by the Indo-Europeans in Central Asia. In East Asia, they domesticated rice, and they also domesticated grains. And one thing that's interesting about China is that you have two major regions of food production. And it's one of the things that has driven up population growth in China throughout history. So we have the Yellow River Basin and the Yangtze River Basin, and they are domesticating rice and grains. In North America, it takes a lot longer. So one of the major crops that you should know from North America is corn, and corn diffuses throughout the Americas, potentially from Mesoamerica. In many societies in North America, especially Native Americans, they have blended agriculture and hunting and gathering. They don't abandon hunting and gathering altogether. mean, we do see this with like Native Americans out west who still participated in the bison hunt, but that does not mean that they do not farm. Most Native American groups had some sort of seasonal farming, and they were also semi-nomadic. They were not fully nomadic. So in the Tehuan Valley in central Mexico, by about 6,700 BCE, we have stone tools and plant experimentation. They domesticate corn. Maize is the same thing as corn. Make sure you know that. Squash and beans. And then in the Andean highlands, this is in South America, in the area that is Peru, they domesticate guinea pigs and llamas. They are also doing a lot of fishing. And there are not a lot of big animals in the Americas. This is going to become really important. So they do supplement their diet with beans and other high protein domesticated plants. In Europe, most of the agriculture diffuses from the Middle East, and we do have two waves of diffusion. Barley, wheat, sheep, goats, and cattle are the biggest things that they are producing. And just keep in mind that we are talking about places in the world that became agricultural. Most of these places are independent food production, but in Europe, you do need to know that they diffused. They did not have independent food production in Europe. And then eventually they do domesticate some other plants, including olives and grapes. And in Africa, you do have independent food production in Africa. Sorghum being one of the main crops that is being domesticated. But Africa remains mostly isolated. Sub-Saharan Africa remains mostly isolated from the main areas of food production at this time. There's also a lot of climate change that is happening in Africa. The Sahara Desert was not as big as it is today. And so some of the regions that are today desert were open for food production, especially the Sahel region. Okay, so consider what theories exist for the development of agriculture, and take a moment to answer the question. And then think about what might be some advantages to settling in villages. And I will be talking about the advantages of village life. Okay, so prior to civilization, humans began to settle down in villages and created somewhat permanent structures in which they could take advantage of the areas that they had farmed. This takes place over hundreds of years, and eventually some of these villages do become larger and they become cities, they become urban. But at first, a lot of the settlement is happening by different groups of peoples and clans that come together and the village grows. First permanent villages are in the Middle East, and we believe that irrigation or defense were likely reasons that people settled into villages. So, for example, since some people had begun farming, they needed to protect those fields, and they weren't just going to abandon those fields for raiders or other peoples to come and gather from the fields that they had worked. Other needs might have included irrigation. So we might need to develop some sort of cooperative structure in order to get big projects done that would provide water to the region. As the communities produce more food, they were able to support a higher population. And eventually some of these communities did grow. Okay, where the beginning of village life did not change much from hunting gathering life. They were still egalitarian. As material wealth increased, these communities began to become more stratified. There's more specialization, more private property, and thus more social stratification. There's also the need for protection and development of armies, and that also plays a role here in the social development. some of the communities you should know.